All right, good evening once again, everybody, and welcome to the Gordon Aikman Lecture Theatre for what is the fifth lecture in this 2018 series of Our Changing World. And it's now the 9th year in which we've been hosting this particular series. My name is Rob Thomas. I'm the course organiser for the undergraduate elective course that spins off the back of these lectures and carries on through the entire semester. It's my privilege to introduce tonight's speaker, who's Dr. Lucy Weir, who's a specialist in dance and performance. So I must admit, I'm quite disappointed that we're using PowerPoint tonight, and it's not a complete, fully integrated performance show. She's currently developing new research project exploring masculinity and violence in post-war performance. She obtained her PhD in History of Art and Theatre Studies from the University of Glasgow as recently as 2013. Since then, she has lectured on art and performance at various institutions, including here at the University of Edinburgh and the Glasgow School of Art. Before taking up her current post, she held a postdoctoral fellowship at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Humanities here at the university. And with Roberto Filippello, Lucy convenes Sexes, a cross-ECA research cluster involving early career researchers and senior faculty in the fields of gender and sexualities. Lucy maintains a strong interest in movement practice alongside her academic research. I do a little bit of that. I move around a little bit. She is also a visiting lecturer in dance at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. So without further ado, please welcome Lucy to give a fascinating talk.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Rob. Thank you also to Jamie for inviting me to take part in this excellent series and this really interesting theme of identity. And my contribution is going to be a consideration or a reconsideration of gender identity and using visual examples to reevaluate notions of gender identity. So, as you now know, I'm a specialist in performance with an emphasis on dance, but this relates to a new research project that I'm exploring on masculinity and violence in post-war performance. And gender identity is really central to that discussion, but also to wider debates and wider issues that have come into my teaching recently as well. And also, as you're no doubt aware, very contemporary issues in society at the moment. So this talk seems to be unusually fortuitously timed given the discussions that are being held at the moment about the Gender Recognition Act and the ongoing debates about gender identity that are seemingly taking over social media. So what I'm going to try and do today is incorporate material from my professional life as an art historian into this discussion of gender identity and to think about the idea of identity as something that is inherently unfixed, something that is malleable and that is constantly changing, and that gender is something that is similarly unfixed and something that is similarly malleable. I should include a slight content warning before I begin that there will be some nudity in these images, which now I know everyone is looking forward to. And there is some reasonably strong material depending on your disposition, but I'm sure we're all adults and friends in this room, so I'm sure that there shouldn't be too many issues with that. And the ultimate aim of what I want to talk about today is to think about the real-world consequences of these discussions about gender identity as well, because this is something that doesn't exist in the abstract, but something that is genuine, that is real, that is a really important part of the human experience, and there is a lot of trauma that is associated with this, the sort of history that I'm going to trace today as well. So my hope with this talk is that by looking at some of the diverse forms of gender identity and the diversities of not simply masculinity and femininity, but more diverse forms of gender identity, that we are maybe moving towards almost a kinder world, and one in which we are maybe a bit more respectful of one another's difference. So now I've set myself an enormous task. I thought I'd just start with a quick overview of some key dates and some key issues that really underpin much of what I'm going to be talking about here. So a couple of these that I want to pick out. 1952, Alan Turing is charged with indecency relating to his homosexuality and was sentenced to hormonal treatment and would die by suicide 2 years later. And homosexuality wasn't decriminalised in the UK until 1967. Now, when it comes to the history of gender identity, gender recognition, and the official aspects of changing gender recognition, Sweden became a world leader in this respect. It was the first country to permit sex change and provided free treatment as well. As recently as 1977, the WHO still listed homosexuality as a mental illness, and this clause wasn't removed until 1990. So what we can perhaps see here is that things are fairly slow to change, and that these official elements are further reinforced in public discourse and in the ways that we relate to one another as well. So we are surrounded by these official frameworks and these official structures which have set up a binary of normality versus abnormality. And normality consists of heterosexual unions which are designed to produce children, and everything that falls out of that category is somehow abnormal. So in 1994, the American Medical Association changed the classification of homosexuality as a mental disorder, and this is where there begins to be a shift in the framing of homosexuality as some kind of mental illness or degeneracy. And in the 21st century, a raft of new legislation came in, lifting the ban of homosexuals in the military in the United Kingdom, legalising civil partnerships, achieving marriage equality in Scotland in 2014, and the Gender Recognition Act coming into place in 2004, which enabled people to legally change their gender. And this is what's currently under debate at the moment. So there's a consultation taking place at the moment about the Gender Recognition Act in an effort to simplify this process, which it's argued is traumatizing and stigmatizing for those individuals who go through it, because it still pathologizes gender dysphoria and pathologizes the desire to, or the necessity to change one's gender identity. So this is the landscape into which I want to draw the examples that I've selected for you today. And what I want to try and do is trace a bit of a history of differing or shifting social attitudes towards gender identity and towards this, and a shift away from the pathologizing of gender identity as well. So it ties in elements of feminism, elements of queer theory, and comes into some contemporary debates about gender identity as well. And I want to also emphasize that there are real-world implications to these debates also, because this is not a discussion that happens in a vacuum. There are other intersecting issues that come into the examples I'm going to talk about today. So we need to think also about the relevance of class and wealth inequality, and a very important one, which is the influence of race or the impact of race. So for instance, recent studies have shown that the average life expectancy for transgender women of colour in the United States is as low as 35. And transgender women experience significantly higher levels of violence and sexual violence. And so these debates around safety and security that are often attached to the transgender issue, as it's sometimes framed, really skews the narrative, and really we need to think about the safety of the individuals concerned rather than buying into a kind of artificial moral panic. That's kind of given away my conclusion, but let's go backwards and see if we can work our way there. So throughout the 19th century, the diagnosis of hysteria was not an uncommon one for female patients, and almost exclusively for female patients. And hysteria was this kind of catch-all term that encompassed a whole range of different emotional and, in some case, physical disorders or disordered behaviors. And hysteria became a really intensely studied condition for doctors throughout the 19th century and into the turn of the 20th century. And this painting of a lesson at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris shows a woman in the middle of a hysterical fainting fit being displayed to, as we can see, an audience of male medics. And the hospital had these kind of star patients who would be brought out almost to perform their hysteria for medics who were interested in examining this woman's condition. And it was a condition that could be attributed to various factors. So there was a theory that it could be connected to sexual dysfunction, that it could be related to excessive menstruation, that it could be connected to homosexuality, that there was a sense in which any kind of what was framed as a disordered behavior could be a contributing factor to this idea of hysteria. And this fascination with hysteria re-emerges in the early 20th century, where it begins to be framed no longer as an exclusively female condition, but is increasingly seen as one that is present in men as well. So the same symptoms of hysteria are becoming more visible in male patients. And the figure who really leads at the forefront of this is Jean-Martin Charcot, who is a physiologist who is associated with diagnosing a number of other conditions, or was behind the discovery, really, of a number of conditions, including forms of multiple sclerosis. But Charcot's contribution to the discussions around hysteria was that he was a really strong advocate that this was not simply a female condition, and it was not caused by some kind of inherent hormonal imbalance. Or one popular theory was that it was caused by the uterus wandering about the body and causing women to go mad. So Charcot took this down a more almost proto-psychoanalytic route, arguing that there were other factors at play in this catch-all condition that was known as hysteria. And something that further shifts this perception of the hysterical woman, or that femininity is inherently unstable, was the impact of the First World War. Because, as I'm sure we're all familiar, in this period, or in the period of the First World War and the aftermath, the phenomenon of shell shock became very visible and extremely apparent. So shell shock, or what we would now probably term post-traumatic stress disorder, was seen to exhibit many of the same characteristics that were visible in the female hysterics that were documented in, for instance, these big psychiatric hospitals like the Salpêtrière. There was also a huge amount of stigma around this. So shell shock throughout the year 1917 was banned as a diagnosis by the British Army, and it was censored even in medical journals. So you weren't allowed to mention that this condition existed. And there was a great stigma and shame associated with the materialization of shell shock, because it was associated, or it was linked to, a kind of fragility, a non-masculine, a feminized fragility. So there was a great deal of resistance to Charcot's theorization that hysteria was not an exclusively female disorder. And equally, there was a great deal of societal stigma around the image of the shell-shocked man, because this went completely against really ingrained notions of masculinity as heroic, as virile, and as physically and emotionally strong. So we have this split, the idea that femininity is unstable, is fragile, and is emotional, and that masculinity is strong, is virile, and is unemotional, is rational. This begins to be really widely upended then in the context of the First World War, where casualty is seen on an enormous scale. Physical trauma is very visible as well, and this side of it, the emotional trauma, the mental trauma, is equally increasingly visible and undeniable. So the First World War begins to dissolve these myths of rationality versus irrationality in this established gender binary, and these ingrained cultural notions that femininity is fixed and masculinity is fixed, and they are entirely oppositional to one another. What begins to happen then in the aftermath of the First World War within visual culture is that artists begin to turn away from 19th century images of the heroic male figure and instead begin to explore the shattered body, the broken body, and they begin to explore emotional trauma in their work as well. This is something that is subsequently turning its head once again with the fascist regimes of the 1930s who tried to go back to that 19th century image of the heroic masculine figure. But subversive artists such as Otto Dix, who was associated with the Berlin Dada circle and later with the Neue Sachlichkeit movement, explored in his work the traumatized figure of the war veteran. Now, Dix had served on the front line of World War I and had a kind of conflicted relationship with the war experience. So we see in a number of his works these almost childlike renderings of himself as a heroic soldier figure. It's like he's drawn himself as an action figure. But he also produces these really striking images, collage-like images of disabled war veterans, most of them living in penury in the aftermath of the First World War. So if we look at the time period here, we're in Weimar, Germany. We're in a country where huge numbers of people have come back from the front, severely disabled, and we also have major reparations that are being paid by a state that is entering a near economic collapse. So in works like The Match Seller, for instance, the blind war veteran we can see has lost both legs and had them replaced with these non-functioning, almost like table legs. In a lot of Dix's work, he uses found materials, so it's kind of, they're mixed media images often. But there's a real emphasis here as well on class difference. So in this image, we see the quite literally well-heeled woman escaping the frame on this side, the dashingly attired guy in his spats and exiting from the other side, and the destitute veteran who's selling matches to try and make a living is being urinated on by this stumpy symbol of Germany, the dachshund. Similarly, works like The Card Players, one of Otto Dix's better-known pieces, reframes this no longer as a purely German problem, but he gives us here images of three different faces of the war experience. So we have the English soldier on the left-hand side, the French soldier in the middle, and the German on the right. But he's given them differing levels of deformity and disability here. So we see that the English soldier is still in his tweed suit, still quite well attired, but as we move around towards the figure of the German soldier on the right-hand side, we can see that he's been chopped off at the waist. And so emasculation becomes a recurring theme in Dix's paintings and in a lot of the visual discourse surrounding the aftermath of the First World War. Here there is a correlation between war defeat and the emasculation of the male body. So, as I said, trauma is a recurring theme here. And it's interesting how trauma and emasculation are married to one another. Now, in this same time period, there is a great deal of playfulness that begins to emerge in the avant-garde around the idea of gender identity. And figures like Marcel Duchamp, who is extremely well known for his enormously eclectic oeuvre, explores gender identity in what I will argue is a slightly problematic way. And in his portraits, or his self-portraits of his alter ego, Rose Sélavy, Duchamp just dresses himself up. He puts on the garb of a middle-class or fairly well-to-do woman and affects this really exaggerated impression of femininity, of feminine identity. I feel like I should always point out when showing this image that the hands weren't his. He had a female friend step in here to give him a kind of delicate framing of the face. But this self-portrait series that he creates that then recurs throughout his work. So we see Rose Sélavy adorning a number of objects, almost like a kind of advertising campaign. It's a really hyper-feminine, fairly or faintly ridiculous impression of femininity that Duchamp evokes. And this seems to be tied to an attitude towards drag culture and towards performing another gender that seeks to extract humor from it and seeks to locate it as something that is ludicrous. And so Duchamp's turn as Rose Célavy is comic, is deliberately comic, that we are supposed to laugh at the ridiculousness of this avowedly heterosexual man dressing himself up as a middle-class lady. One of his contemporaries, however, the surrealist Claude Cahn, does something very, very different, albeit still exploring gender difference and gender identity in her extraordinary series of self-portraits that she took throughout the 1920s and 30s. Cahn was born Lucy Schwab and changed her name to the deliberately androgynous-sounding Claude Cahn so that it was a name that took on, or could be read as either masculine or feminine. And she refused to define her sexuality, she refused to conform to the idea of a singular gender, but used her photographic practice as a way of exploring different identities. So we see in these really diverse images all of the different forms of identity that Cahn takes on, that she masquerades as a soldier, as a harlequin, in this really ambiguous image on the bottom left, a double portrait called What Do You Want From Me? She frames herself as this sort of two-headed figure, almost as if she's asking herself the question. Whereas with Duchamp, the dressing up has a deliberately comic effect, with Cahn, there's a desire to shift the boundaries of gender distinction, to shift the boundaries of gender identity. And this is something that runs much deeper in her practice, and also we need to think about in the context of where she was making it. Most of the major figures associated with the surrealist movement were men, and I think it's fair to say it was a pretty misogynistic movement. So women were very often kept to the sidelines of the movement and tended not to feature in the big histories of surrealism until more recent academic literature started to reframe this. So Cahn is working in this quite intensely gendered environment where she is subverting ideas of what it is to be either male or female, that she evokes rather the idea of a third gender in her photographic self-portraits, and she plays with the malleability of gender to evoke all of these different characters. So it's quite an early example of someone playing around with shattering this binary of masculine and feminine as fixed and oppositional, and instead arguing that there's a third way, that there is a territory that exists somewhere in between. So Cahn creates a space in between the genders, and this is one that she plays around in, or one that she experiments with. Now this leads me on to the inevitable theorist who is associated with this discussion, Judith Butler, whose key texts, Gender Trouble and Bodies That Matter, explore the idea of gender performativity. Now the roots of Butler's theory lie in a number of different existing scholars' work. So Butler is not the first person to propose that gender is something that is performed, but she expands upon the arguments put forward by Michel Foucault and Joan Riviere to argue that gender is not something that is imposed on us by something that actually exists, but that is something that is culturally constructed. So her argument is that gender is not fixed, and that all of the framings we associate with gender are artificial, in that they are conditioned by the culture that surrounds us and the society that surrounds us. But what's really crucial to Butler's argument is the proposal that this is something that is not necessarily voluntary, that we're not aware that we're doing it, but it's something that's achieved through constant repetition. So to really simplify this, when you think about a baby being born, one of the first questions that's asked is whether the baby is male or female. And that immediately tells you what color of toy or outfit you are going to buy that child, because blue is for boys and pink is for girls, and that's fixed, and that's something that we don't question. But there is no reason for that. There's no reason for that other than that we live within a culture that tells us that is the case. And when it comes to other stereotypes that are associated with gender identity, we really need to start questioning where these come from. Because, as I'm hoping to argue today, the reiteration of these stereotypes can have a really negative effect on all of us. So this conversation about gender identity is not simply about binary notions of gender, it's not simply about transgender identity, but it's about everyone. It's about how it affects all of us, because we are all impacted by these notions that are handed down from above. So when Butler says that gender is performative, she argues that it's something we begin to take part in very early on in life, that we see the culture that surrounds us and we repeat the patterns that we are surrounded by. So very quickly, children will start to self-select what toys they play with, because it's reinforced that boys play with trucks, boys like football, girls like ballet, and girls like pink things, to put it very, very crudely. But this is something that tends to be reinforced by the cultures that those children find themselves in. One of the unfortunate facts about this is it's very difficult to resist it, because no matter how conscious we might be of these negative stereotypes and the harmful effects of them, it's very, very difficult to break away from them or to mitigate their effects. I just want to mention in passing 2 really excellent texts on this by Cordelia Fine that approach this from a resoundingly scientific point of view, which is certainly not what I can position myself as doing today as an art historian. But Fine exposes the flaws in science that reinforce gender stereotypes, and particularly that reinforce the stereotypes around subject areas that men and women go into. So the notion that STEM subjects are favoured by men because men have mathematical brains, whereas women have brains that are more suited to the humanities. Now, the root of that thought goes back to this rationality versus irrationality that we saw was so dominant in the 19th century. And Fine really dismantles this by showing time and again that these distinctions are reinforced by cultures around us rather than any notion of hard wiring. If all of the work in neuroplasticity is taught as anything, is that we are not hardwired. Nothing in our brains is hardwired, and there's nothing that makes a brain uniquely male or female. So for the remainder of my discussion today, what I want to do is draw in some images from my own research and from my own teaching and my own work to try and trouble and destabilize these ideas of gender norms and gender identity a bit further, and to get us thinking about how unfixed gender identity really is. There will be a bit of an emphasis on the idea of masculinity because that is the area in which I'm working just now. So one of the first that I wanted to start with, I did promise there would be some nudity, is Pierre Molyneux's photographs, again self-portraits, and another figure that's associated with the Surrealist movement. So he mainly made these self-portraits in private and was very clear that they were for his own use and for his own interests. In fact, in his own words, he said they were for his own stimulation. And they drew upon Molyneux's deep fascination with fetish and with sexual fetish. And Molyneux was a gay man who identified as male, but was fascinated by the possibilities afforded by women's clothing, and particularly women's underwear. And he defines eroticism as, these are his words, a privileged place, a theatre in which incitement and prohibition play their roles, and where the most profound moments of life make sport. So he intended his photographs to shock. They were designed to unsettle and to provoke audiences. And he was really playing around with the boundaries of what the audience would accept. So he was playing around with the idea of disgust and provocation. Molyneux was hugely influential for a generation of performance artists that followed, because so much of his photographic practice is about transforming his own body and looking at the capacity of his own body to be shifted, to be made malleable. And this ties in to the idea that gender, again, is performative, that something that is a difficulty for Butler is the notion of the drag queen and is the idea of drag performance. Because this, in terms of looking at the instability between biological sex and gender, there's a problem that drag presents Butler and by extension us, which is, what is the unsettling part of drag performance? Is it the clothing or is it the behavior of the person in the clothing? So is it to do with physical gesture and the way that a person takes up space, or is it to do with something that is chosen to cover the body? Are those the kind of physical elements that determine gender identity? Now, Molyneux's work, which plays around with drag and plays around with performance, also has a kind of deliberately self-degrading air to it, because we know that he was deeply interested in BDSM, bondage, domination, sadomasochism. And this is another element that comes into a lot of performance practice throughout the 1970s and 80s. So there is a recurring theme then that begins to emerge in the aftermath of the First World War with the mortification of the male body, that the virile, heroic male of the 19th century has been done away with. And artists and performers are beginning increasingly to experiment with the idea of the male body as fragile and to put the male body under duress, to see the effect of harm and physical suffering in the male body. So there is a kind of feminization of the war hero that occurs here, that these fixed notions of heroic virile masculinity are shifted and reframed as something that is fragile and that is in some cases quite literally pierced as well. So the recurring theme or recurring feature is the image of Saint Sebastian, the Christian martyr, who recurs throughout so many different facets of 20th century visual culture and is often invoked as an intensely homoerotic totem as well. So we have Otto Dix, who we saw earlier. His drawing of St. Sebastian is completely covered in arrows, and the male form here is almost obscured by the bodily mortification that's taken place. Quite a bit later, at the end of the 20th century, the performance artist Ron Athey subjects himself to a process of being not shot through by arrows, but slowly pierced by arrows in his work Martyrs and Saints, which reimagines the lives of various saints in a sort of bondage fantasy dungeon. It's a lot of fun. I'd recommend it if you have 10 minutes on YouTube later. But what we then see is there's a conflation between between religious imagery that begins to creep into this kind of visual discourse and with this idea of male mortification. So the male heroic figure, the virile heroic figure of the 19th century is gradually being transformed, and as we see here, really starting to be elided with the imagery of Christ as mortified flesh, as victim, as suffering male figure. But this, I would argue, is a really interesting destabilizing of the notion of masculinity, because there is an embrace of fragility, there's a celebration of fragility. And in the case of artists like Athey, Molyneux, and figures like Bob Flanagan as well, there's a very deliberate and very explicit link made between pain and pleasure, between physical suffering and humiliation and sexual pleasure. And this has a really unnerving effect because it further destabilizes the notion of the heroic heterosexual male identity, and all of these firmly held frameworks begin to dissolve. Now, if I can find the right moment in this, the artist Bastian Adder is coming at this from a rather different context, but this is where, again, I want to think about this idea of fragility, of male fragility, masculinity and fragility. In the work I'm Too Sad to Tell You, which has no sound, he films himself having read the contents of postcards, which we don't get to see. As the audience, we don't get to see what's on them. But he Sorry. I'll come back to this. He films himself weeping while reading the content of postcards that we aren't able to see. And he presents himself face onto the camera, properly sobbing, showing us what we presume is a genuine display of emotion. Now, this is a work that's been read in different ways. It's been argued that this is an exploration of male fragility and emotion. It has also been argued by theorists like Jennifer Doyle that this is actually a very manipulative move on Bastian Adder's part, because, as Doyle argues, if a woman were to film herself doing this, would we receive the work differently? If a female artist filmed herself sobbing uncontrollably with a title as melodramatic as "I'm Too Sad to Tell You," would we not find ourselves going back to that discourse about female hysteria and irrationality? Victimization is also employed in the work of André Stitt, who is a Northern Irish performance artist. Much of his work relates to his cultural identity as a Protestant growing up in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. And Stitt, again, draws religious imagery into a lot of his work as well. So in Conviction, a title that, again, seems to be quite loaded, he invokes a number of very striking visual signifiers of Northern Irish identity into a work that explores penance and suffering as a way of redemption. So Stitt had himself tarred and feathered and then crawled on his knees on a set route through South Belfast that ended in his father's favourite pub. Tarring and feathering was, as we know, it's a historical form of punishment, but one that gained new currency during the era of the Troubles, where it was often used to punish specifically women who had been found to be having affairs with British soldiers or with members of the RUC. So women would often have their heads shaved, have boiling tar poured over them, covered in feathers, and then tied to a public landmark like a lamppost with a sign around their neck telling of their transgression. So here, Stitt is deliberately invoking an image that has a strong cultural resonance, but using it to play around again with the idea of gender and with the idea of masculinity and femininity, and tying it to the idea of humiliation, and tying it to a narrative of suffering and redemption. Similarly, in the 1970s, we have a number of female performance artists who choose to explore different aspects of gender role play and gender performativity in their work. So this is a period where there's a huge explosion of feminist performance art. A really key figure in this is Ana Mendieta, whose reputation sadly lagged for many years in the art historical literature, but who is now increasingly being written of and spoken of more, whose tragically short career often explored femininity and notions of idealized feminine beauty. So in her facial hair transplants work, which she created while still a student, she had a male colleague shave his facial hair off and then in front of an audience began to attach it to her own face to create these different male looks. And the whole process was, as you can see, quite beautifully documented. So this is performativity in action. This is someone literally taking the hair and the body parts from a male colleague and sticking them onto her face to transform herself in front of her eyes. And the fact that this happens in front of an audience, the fact that this is staged, is quite a nice illustration of this idea of gender performativity, because we see the transformation happening before our eyes. I would argue that Mendieta is not doing this necessarily for comedic value, but more to explore and to challenge the idea of feminine beauty, of feminine aesthetic beauty, that she is deliberately posing for these very striking portraits with the inclusion of quite realistic-looking facial hair. So this is, again, quite different to what Duchamp is doing. It's not the dressing up for laughs, but this is more an exploration of what it is to be male or female. But it's also an exploration of what it is to be beautiful. and suggesting that, again, this is something that is unfixed, that is malleable, and that can be played with. I'm going to show a short clip, if I can, from the documentary film Paris is Burning.
Town and country, exclusively done.
Get into their suits, I said. The well-dressed men of the 80s, get into the suits and get into the pumps.
In real life, you can't get a job as an executive unless you have the educational background and the opportunity. Now, the fact that you are not an executive is merely because of the social standing of life. That is just a pure thing. Black people have a hard time getting anywhere. And those that do are usually straight. In a ballroom, you can be anything you want. You're not really an executive, but you're looking like an executive. And therefore, you're showing the straight world that I can be an executive. If I had the opportunity, I could be one, because I can look like it. And that is like a fulfillment. Your peers, your friends are telling you, oh, you make a wonderful executive.
Is this the businessman of the 80s or what?
High fashion Parisian, model de fact. Chantez, 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 chantez. Model, thin, streamline, trim, model.
The category is Butch Queen, first time in drags at a ball.
You know what I mean?
You know what Paris means.
Exactly. Butch Queen.
Butch Queen.
Butch Queen.
Butch Queen.
So, the film Paris is Burning is a not uncontroversial documentary, but a really fascinating insight into drag ball culture in Harlem in the 1980s, in the late 1970s and into the 1980s. And this was a very underground phenomenon and a performative space where primarily people of color were able to perform as different categories, as different embodiments, different archetypes, and would compete against one another for trophies and for recognition. And while there are issues with the way that the film is framed, and there has been quite a lot of discussion about the way that the filmmaker approached her subject matter. Bell Hooks has written really extensively about this. What Paris is Burning shows us, and what it illustrates quite profoundly and very movingly, is that for the subjects that it documents, life is not difficult simply because of sexuality or gender identity, but also because of race, class, and wealth inequality. And what it gives us is a snapshot of a space, a safe space in which people who are marginalized on almost every level from the society that they live in are able to explore the identities that they will never be able to inhabit in the real world. It's also a film that refers us back to the very real violence that marginalized people face. So one of the subjects of the film we discover towards the end has been very brutally murdered by a client, and we realize as the film wears on that many of the figures that we're meeting are homeless and are living as sex workers. So this is a film that gives us a different insight into gender performativity and into shifting notions of gender identity. And it also illustrates, as this clip does, the importance of the idea of passing, which is something that, a term that has come from critical race theory, but that also has been brought into discussions about gender identity. So passing refers to the ability to convincingly pass as another identity. So this could be a person who is light-skinned and is able to pass for white. That's where the terminology originally comes from. And in this case, as one of the cast is telling us, the people involved in these balls are playing around with how realistically they can pass. At one point it said, passing is the ability to come home from a ball and not get beaten up on your way home from the subway because people will believe that you are a woman. But this is a film that really explores different aspects of gender performativity, because we see that it's not simply about binary ideas of masculinity and femininity, but within these categories, there are all of these different identities people are exploring as well. One of my favorites has to be the idea of executive realness, of dressing yourself up as a businessman and trying to pass as a businessman. Because it's not simply about being able to dress up in the way that Duchamp does, but to actually bear yourself differently, to hold your body in space differently. Diane Torr, an artist and performer who very sadly passed away last year, explored this in her Man for a Day workshops, where she would take groups of women and teach them how to pass as men in society. But this wasn't simply about putting on a suit and putting on facial hair. Torr was 5'3", and she wanted to find a way that she could convincingly go out in the world and convince people that she was a man. So she taught her workshops how to take up space, how to physically own the space around you. And this is all about challenging and unsettling these fixed notions of identity that are handed down to us from a very early age. If we think about how people sit on a train or on the subway, not to come back to my personal pet peeve about that term manspreading, but how often you see people taking up huge amounts of space. And if you look around, you see women are conditioned to take up less space, to sit with their legs crossed, to make ourselves as small as possible. But there's no reason for this. There's no fixed reason for this. It's something that we are conditioned to do from an early age. And as Butler says, we repeat it unconsciously and so often that it becomes second nature. What was so subversive about Torr's workshops was that she gave people a key into doing the opposite, into actually embodying something else, into embodying another experience. And this leads me on to the last section of what I want to talk about today, which is the idea of binary notions of gender being extremely unhelpful, and trying to move us away from the idea that masculinity and femininity are our fixed binary sole alternatives, but to think a little bit about the space that exists in between these notions. So there's a fascination with human sexuality throughout the 19th century, and we see this come up in Foucault's History of Sexuality. He writes about this quite extensively. The medicalization of sexuality and the desire to scientifically examine human sexuality. And this also appears in the really fetishistic photographs, medicalized photographs, as in this one by Nadar, where the subject is obscured. The humanity, the individuality of the subject is obscured. And perhaps the most upsetting part of this image is the hand over the subject's face, that we get a real visceral sense of the shame that this person feels, and that their genitals are put on full display. That this is a person who is being displayed as a medical oddity rather than as a human being. And I want to finish today by looking at the work of a couple of artists who have sought to invert this and who have sought to reframe intersex and transgender bodies, and to get us to, in an effort to get us to rethink notions of aesthetic beauty and binary notions of male and female beauty and aestheticism. One of them is the artist Ma Li-ming, also known as Fen Ma Li-ming, who is based in People's Republic of China, and whose work often explored public nudity. So he was very heavily censored for his work and has been arrested on a number of occasions, but has evolved a performance persona, which he goes by the name Fen Ma Li-ming when performing in this guise, who is styled as an extremely conventionally beautiful woman. And Fen Ma Li-ming hypes up his innate femininity in these portrait photographs. But a bit like Anna Mendietta's work, Ma Li-ming allows us to see the transition, to see the process of becoming. And these artists who want to document that process and who put the idea of process rather than end product front and center are reinforcing the idea that identity and gender identity is not something that's fixed. It's not a starting point and an ending point, but it's something that can be malleable and that can be changed and that can take on a number of different guises and a number of different forms. So when we're allowed to see behind the curtain, we see that these things are not fixed in time and space. And the final artist that I want to draw on today is Del Grace Volcano, who's a wonderful portrait artist who was born intersex, was raised female, and now identifies as neither male nor female, and will alternately use pronouns he and she and also they. And I really love this statement from Volcano's artistic manifesto, saying, "I name myself a gender abolitionist, a part-time gender terrorist, an intentional mutation in intersex by design as opposed to diagnosis." And later, Volcano would say, "I'm not really a gender abolitionist if what that means is I want to live in a world where gender does not exist. I recognize, validate, and support those who want to live a monogendered lifestyle. I just wish they would grant me the same privileges." I think that's the key point that I'm trying to reach in this lecture, that when it comes to this reinforcement of the idea of essential gender difference, it has an intensely harmful effect on all of us. Anyone who doesn't fall in automatically to these pre-established categories of what makes a man and what makes a woman is immediately sidelined. But even within those categories, the reiteration of what it is to be a man and what it is to be a woman can be incredibly harmful. This is something that Cordelia Fine talks about extensively, where she cites studies that show when male and female students are given maths tests, every time women have to state their gender on the front of the paper, they will perform worse than men. And this is something that has been taken to children as well, that when young primary school-age children are asked to take a test and they're told it will evaluate their ability to become engineers when they grow up, the girls do worse than the boys. And they do worse than anyone in the control groups. So we're all embodying this. We're all taking in these messages from an early age, and we're unconsciously reinforcing them. And while it maybe seems that we can't necessarily undo that, we certainly can't undo it in one fell swoop, I would argue that if we were to follow Volcano's argument, not necessarily in abolishing gender, but in just being a bit kinder about what gender identity is, that we could start to live in a slightly more reasonable world, and one in which there is scope for difference, and there is scope for finding beauty in difference as well. And I think that's probably time for me to wrap up. Thank you very much.
Lucy, thank you very much indeed for a fascinating talk. We have time now for some questions. I'm sure Lucy will be very, very keen to receive questions. If we could just have the house lights up a little bit so I can see hands as they come up. That's better, thank you. I did have a question until you actually mentioned the phrase gender abolitionist, and you actually answered the question I was going to ask in the first point. There was a hand straight in front of me just now. Just, sorry, if you come back down the stairs, just the individual in the green top. We're not allowed to refer to any kind of assumed or inferred or implied gender in this session.
So you talked a lot about the demasculinity, if it will, of the male after the First World War. Is there any similar thing that happened, say, after the Second World War for women? Because, of course, we were then allowed to get jobs and kind of move out of this image of like hyper-femininity and the staying at home and looking after the kids. Was there a similar thing that happened?
So in the aftermath of both the First and Second World War, you do begin to see a shift emerging in women's art practice as well. I would say where this probably really takes off is a bit later. So it's probably the 1960s and into the 70s, because that's where performance art really explodes. And what I didn't, unfortunately, have the capacity to look at today was that side of things where female performance artists are really beginning to dismantle fixed ideas of gender roles, and particularly the idea of the woman's place in the home. So artists like Martha Rosler, for instance, Yoko Ono, the Fluxus artist Shigeru Kubota as well, and then artists also like Mendieta and many within that ilk all begin to put the body central to their work. And a lot of that work explores idealized notions of femininity. So a lot of it is taking aim at the idea of the female muse and the passive female muse. And the body becomes an increasingly controversial ground.
Thank you.
Another question. Is it at the front here?
Thank you very much for an enlightening lecture. Can you comment just a little bit on how you think as a society we can get men to loosen a little bit their definition of masculinity? Because it seems that women are a little more tolerant of differences in sexual expressions or gender identity, but it is men that are the most rigid about it, and especially when they're together as a group, refusing to let it go.
I think if I can answer this question, I'll probably get a Nobel Prize, but I think the problem is it still involves all of us. That's the issue that really comes across from Butler's writing, is that we're all complicit in this performance. We're all subtly reinforcing this idea of difference and of essential difference. And I think that there's something unfortunate also in the way that a lot of the discourse around masculinity is framed, because there is this, we tend to go back to the same slightly lazy tropes of men find it hard to talk about emotions. And when we say that, we're reinforcing those same gender stereotypes. You know, any campaign that talks about men find it hard to talk about emotions suggests that the flip side of that is women are emotional creatures because they can talk about emotions. So I think it's about how we reframe our language around the whole thing. It's not up to one side of the debate to try and fix it. But I think a starting point, at least, is for all of us to think about the way we use language and how we respond to one another, and why we have these instinctive responses, why we normalize certain patterns of behavior. Because for me, something that was a real turning point was reading Delusions of Gender. When I saw hard facts in front of me, it made me stop and think, oh God, even I find myself saying stuff that's in here. I talk about myself as someone who's not, I don't have a scientific brain. I'm not wired that way. But these are things that I've unconsciously heard and I've reiterated all through my life. So I think it's the start of rejigging this is for us all to just have a bit more self-awareness and to think about how we perceive ourselves, and to just try and have a bit of empathy, really. I think that's the thing that's missing from a lot of discussion around gender identity is empathy, and is the ability to accept difference. But if part of that is that we're subtly reinforcing it ourselves, then we're always going to play into the problem. I don't know if that's an answer at all.
Question on the far side? The blue jumper?
Hello. So I was interested in what you were talking about with Duchamp and the problem with his work about it evoking laughter and being something that's associated with humour. and how today there are a lot of artists working in drag that is very much connected to humour, particularly also like drag kings like Pex or Boy Box, but also men mainly. I mean, ones I'm thinking about men like Bob the Drag Queen, for example, who like a lot of his act lies on it being funny.
Yeah.
And how can we take that as a positive thing, and can we take humour with drag positively without taking it as an offence and a mockery?
I think humour is an inherent part of drag performance. I have two thoughts on this, and I'm going to try and summarise them. One of my issues with the way that Duchamp invokes drag is that Duchamp is not a drag performer, and he's the way that he performs, the way that he drags up, and the purpose is different, because it seems like it is. I always have this image of him and Man Ray as two teenage boys giggling and putting on furs and finding it really, really funny because it's so ludicrous. And I think it's about the intention that lies behind it. But I think there is also a point to be made about potentially how the kind of comic element of drag is maybe being, particularly with the popularity of programs like RuPaul's Drag Race, is kind of being played for laughs in a way that I don't think is all that helpful in terms of the breadth of the mainstream audiences that it's reaching. So I think there's a bit of a risk within. I'm really wary of getting into that territory, but I think there's a bit of a risk with drag that it leaves itself open to be quite problematic, is what I'm trying to say. But with Duchamp, my separation out of what he's doing is more to do with intention and more to do with who he is as an artist, because it's a very different. There's a similar moment in the film Entr'acte by René Clair, which Duchamp features in as well, where I think it's Eric Satie, the composer, appears in a sort of ballerina's outfit and is twirling round on a glass table. And every time I show this to students, people burst out laughing because he's got a huge beard. And as the camera pans up, you see that he's got this massive beard. So there's always this kind of comic element being invoked, but it's one that in some situations doesn't sit quite right, because I feel the intention that lies behind it is more about reinforcing binary notions of gender than it is about challenging them.
Oh, we have suddenly, with sprouting hands left, right and centre. I think the one at the centre came up first. Can you just wait for the microphone, because just to include everybody.
Hi. I was hoping we can maybe expand on. I was also interested as to why Duchamp's performance is comical. I agree that as he's not a drag performer, there I understand, but then when it comes to performing femininity or masculinity with a comical effect, burlesque is intended to be funny, because sexual relationships or interaction can be funny. So then seeing drag performed with funny side to it, with a comical side, that seems, I kind of understand partially what you're trying to say about it being problematic, but I'm not sure. I would like you to elaborate, I guess.
On Duchamp or on drag?
Yeah, on Duchamp.
On Duchamp. So the reason that I find Duchamp problematic is partly to do with my own bias about Duchamp's work, but that there is so humour is a huge part of what he does. Humour is something that runs throughout his work from start to finish. I think it's also fair to say that his relationship with women, or his kind of depiction of women, is throughout his career more broadly, beyond just the limits of Rose Sélavy, is also a bit problematic. And the distinction that I was trying to draw with the image of Duchamp as Rose Sélavy and with Claude Can, for instance, is to show that what Duchamp is doing is something that reinforces an essential difference between what is masculine and what is feminine. And that it reinforces the idea that these are oppositional identities. Whereas what Can does is she creates a third space in which new possibilities emerge. And she's really destabilizing the idea that masculinity and femininity are oppositional and that they are the only routes. I could do another lecture on Duchamp if you like, but I don't think anyone wants to hear it just now.
Okay. There were two questions over here, one down the front, I think, earlier on. They would probably have to be the final one, so just back over there. Yeah.
I wanted to get your opinion on being in the middle, and whether, like, to push forward, would it be better to create identity for the middle or to keep it fluid? Because, like, with what's happening in America, obviously it being evoked, is it because there's a fear that you can't actually imagine someone in the middle?
Oh, it's two huge questions. Let me think. So the second one's probably a bit easier to answer. I think it is to do with fear, but I think it's an entirely misplaced fear. I think it's pretty obvious that it's a misplaced fear, because something that even the unpleasant but historical Nadar image shows is that a third gender or intersex conditions it's a natural part of human biology. It's a thing that happens. There is a very, very strong societal pressure to conform to one or the other, so that a baby born with indeterminate genitals will be assigned a gender at birth. That has always been the practice, because there's this understanding that you can't possibly live unless you're one or the other. But in reality, there isn't really any reason that has to be the case. That's kind of what Butler's saying, that's what a number of these theorists are saying, that's what I'm trying to get at here, is I think that we can't be blamed for buying into these notions because they are so utterly ingrained in the culture that we live in. But when we start to question them, the solidity of those foundations becomes a lot shakier. And I think there is something very alarming that's happening right now, particularly in the US, because there's an attempt to erase different forms of identity, but also to go backwards. It feels like things are sliding back to a kind of 18th, 19th century notion of identity. But if we've learned anything from feminist criticism, so think about someone like Susan Faludi, she talked about the idea of backlash. And it feels like that's the moment we're in right now, is that every time progress is made, there's an inevitable pushback. And I think that is, unfortunately, what's happening. But that it doesn't necessarily mean we have to go backwards. I think that what's happened in particularly in the last 5 years, or even more recently than that, is that people's minds do seem to be opening a bit, and there does seem to be space being created. And ultimately, that's kind of what I'm trying to get at with this talk, is the idea of just creating a space for difference. And it doesn't have to be a space for difference that means, like Del Grace Volcano says, it's not about abolishing gender. It's just about recognizing that, A, it's not really anyone's business, and B, it doesn't actually do you any harm. So we should all maybe get over ourselves.
The question in the front.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask on your opinion on the differences, if there are any, between gender and sex. Because I've heard both terms used under the same definition, other definitions, and then also discussed in terms that one can be changed and one can't be. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts.
That's another really thorny one, actually, because there's this sort of discourse that seems to be taken as gospel now, that biological sex is fixed and gender identity is unfixed. And then even that, I think, is kind of troublesome, because biological sex doesn't always fall into binary categories. And even when it comes to just having done a very, very small amount of digging, because as I said, I'm not a scientist, but doing a bit of digging into intersex conditions or intersex definitions, it's an almost mind-boggling list that falls into that category. And so I think there's maybe something a little bit dangerous about making too hard a distinction between gender and sex. This is another thing that Butler advocates against, that she does talk about both sex and gender as being sort of culturally and socially constructed. Because I think there is a bit of a danger of saying, well, on one level, there are these two categories, but on another, there's a plethora of categories. I think that we need to kind of change our thinking even around the idea of biological sex, because it's not always as clear-cut as we make it out to be. And all of this comes back to a kind of history of erasure as well, that we don't want to slide back into editing things out of journals or editing out identities or trying too strongly to reinforce the idea of a binary. I think, again, that kind of taps into your question about what can we do. I think that we are always unconsciously reinforcing these things. So personally, I feel a little bit that going too heavily to the sex and gender are distinct argument in its own way subtly reinforces the idea that there is an essential masculinity and an essential femininity, and those are the two categories that we have. Again, I think that's a bit of a non-answer, but it's a tricky question.
I think we had probably better close off there. Can I firstly thank you, the audience, for coming up with some absolutely fantastic questions, very insightful. And can I then ask you to join me in thanking Lucy once again for a truly wonderful presentation.